So the outline of my talk, I'm going to give you some brief slides about what the vegetation model really does, even though David Rupp told me, don't put too many method slides, everybody falls asleep, so I'll try to be quick. And then a few results that will show you what the vegetation distribution looks like under all these climate scenarios, what the fire frequency does, and some estimates of carbon stocks. So the vegetation model that my team runs is a dynamic global vegetation model, so it was built to address coarse scale processes. We're in version 2, MC2. Some of you have heard about MC1. MC2 is the C++ version, and very much looks like the old one. It's 3 modules, composed of 3 modules, one that gives you vegetation distribution, one that gives you carbon pools and nutrient cycling, and one that simulates dynamic wildfire. It uses monthly data. For climate, we use minimum and maximum monthly temperature, monthly precipitation, and vapor pressure. The soils information is extremely important, of course, because in the future, as it gets warmer and drier, the soil water availability is key. We use mineral soil depth, soil texture, rock fragment, and bulk density. We have been using future climate provided by John Abatsoglu. In yellow are the downscale data that were available that we've been running. In orange are the available data that we are running currently and will have by probably the end of this month. And the list of all the climate models that, Phil and Dave have been talking about with the ranking. Today, I'm only going to show results for the RCP 8.5, the representative concentration pathway 8.5. On the left, you see that curve that most of you have seen with the pathway of emissions. And if you look at the little black dots that follow that line, you see that we are definitely going towards the 8.5 pathways and not the 4.5, despite our best hopes. And if you look on the right-hand side, you see that China's emissions are rising, not plateauing. So I don't think we're going to switch to 4.5 anytime soon. The model includes algorithm to simulate fire suppression. So whatever result I showed you, assume that suppression starts in 1950 for a particular set of thresholds, which means that only catastrophic fires occur due to the buildup of fuel loads or deep drought conditions. Very briefly, model assumptions. It's all about potential vegetation. There's no species level information. That's done by a collaborator on this project, Nicholas Koop and Dick Waring. When we talk about grasses, it includes forbs, cactuses, mosses, and lichens, which are very important but are not considered as specific life forms in our model. We do not do wetlands or marshes, nor rivers. We're running in what we call savanna mode, which means there's constantly competition between grasses and trees. We do not have a specific shrub physiology, no cell-to-cell communication. In other words, water doesn't flow down slope, and fire ignition is not limiting. The nitrogen demand is always met by nitrogen fixation, and we're using a moderate CO2 fertilization effect. Okay, this is a very boring slide, but I thought I'd put that out. So you cannot say that I didn't tell you all the caveats. So the protocol to run this complex model, the first thing we do is we run an equilibrium model that provides a map of vegetation distribution based on climate. It's a static model. We use an average climate, and you get this map. Then we run a carbon model to say what are the initial values for these vegetation types. So that's the initialization. And then we start running with a time series of climate that has been detrended to spin it up with the dynamic fire. So suddenly we try to aim at a reasonable fire return interval for current conditions. Once we are there, then we start running with real climate data. So this means we've been running over 3,000 years to just initialize the model. And then we start running in 1895 and go all the way to 2100. So all this to tell you, it's a complex way to run, and we run on a supercomputer, the NASA supercomputer, so I acknowledge Ramanamani, who has given us free access to that computer. Without that resource, we would have a heck of a time running for 12 different models and 2 RCP scenarios. So the results, vegetation distribution, fire frequency, and carbon stocks. These are all the potential vegetation types that you're going to see colors on. I'm not going to show you this all the time, just to show you we have forest, woodlands, grasslands, and different types, temperate, subtropical, and tropical. Okay, so now instead of showing you a movie, because there's no time dimension in this, you can see on the left-hand side there's a map for historical condition. In the center, it's going to be mid-century, and on the right, it's going to be the end of the century. I'm going to show you 10 slides for 10 different models. And so I want you to focus in the Pacific Northwest. The dark green is maritime forest. The lighter green is temperate cool mixed. And we separate the two. We assume that along the coast there's very little difference between day and night temperature, winter and summer. It's dampened because of the ocean. But when things change in terms of the amplitude between minimum and maximum temperature, that's when we call it cool mixed. And then the subtropical mixed is something that comes from the south, which means things are getting warmer and you're getting this subtropical forest moving in. As you can see here, the dark green disappears and you have this bright green that expands along the coast. And then if you focus on the upper right of the map, you see this orange color, which is temperate grassland. And because we see in the future an increase in CO2 concentration, we have a shrubification of the West that's actually being seen in real life. Of course, grazing interacts with it in reality, but you see this orange that disappearing, and temperate shrubland, that grayish, tannish thing, takes over, and then the pink is a subtropical shrubland. So not only do you get a shrubification, a woodification, you also get life forms that are adapted to warmer temperatures. Again, remember, this is potential vegetation. So on top of that, you can put a layer of land use, and that will change a lot of things. Another thing you should also look at is that the red at the bottom in the southwest, these are the semi-arid grasslands and deserts. And so these will vary and change depending on the climate model we use. So this is going to go fairly fast for you, but so this is the GFDL ESM2M. This is the INM-CM4 from Russia. And you can see that at the end of the century, it's a very different pictures from the previous one. So then there's Australia, the Australian model, CSIRO. Then MIROC 5, Japan. And then the MRI CGCM, also from Japan. And then the GFDL ESM, the French model, another Japanese model, but this time ESM means Earth System Model. It's actually a model that has climate, ocean, and vegetation included. And then the Canadian Earth System Model, which also includes fire, and then the Chinese model. And so we were very excited to run these models because it was the first time the model was run on an actual GCM and the Earth System Model. So it's the GCM plus vegetation dynamics. And so when we ran our model on it, you do get different results. So the top two are the results from the GCM, the bottom two are from the Earth System Model. And again, these are preliminary results, and I call them preliminary because I haven't had time to sit down and really look at all the intricacies. But when we're going to write these publications, there's going to be a lot to say. And then this is a comparison between the same model but two versions. There's ESM2G and ESM2M. And this morning I asked David Rupp at breakfast, what's the difference between those two GCMs? And he didn't know. So just stay tuned. We'll do research and figure out what the difference is. But obviously it gives us different results, even though it comes from the same modeling team. And so when you summarize everything, this is the agreement between all the model instances. So in red is where the 12 models agree there's going to be a change in vegetation. And so you have mid-century on the left and the end of the century on the right. And you can see that the change between historical and mid-century is larger. There's more shifts in vegetation than at the end of the century. In other words, it kind of stabilizes by mid-century. And we're trying to figure out, okay, what makes it change? Why is it so flashy? So in the southwest, the deserts, because you get shrubification, you get a little bit of flashiness. You get like a monsoon, things like that. So suddenly it greens up, you have more vegetation, and you switch from a grassland, from a shrubland to a grassland, you close canopy, that sort of thing. In the Pacific Northwest, it's a different story. You look at fire frequency over the same area. This is, on the left-hand side, is the average fire frequency simulated for the 20th century. On the right-hand side, fire frequency average for the 21st century. And you see that in general, if you kind of take the overall picture, you get an increase in fire frequency. And then this shows the change in ecosystem carbon. Everything that's yellow and red is an increase in carbon, and in blue is a decrease in carbon. And what shocks everybody is if you look in the Pacific Northwest, you have a big blue map there. And so we're going to lose carbon in our region according to this model with potential vegetation. You also see along the Rocky Mountain, you see some blue colors there, so high mountains. And so this is the summary picture in very few colors, which really makes the point. On the left-hand side, the average ecosystem carbon for historical conditions. You see the green, which is the most productive region, our green forest, due to all this rainfall we get. And then the next two are what's happening to carbon pools, mid-century and end of the century. Everything in black means loss of carbon. And so you've seen the pattern. And so we're trying now to separate things by ecoregions, so we can really separate the coastal forest and the Cascade from the rest of the state of Washington and Oregon. And so you can see the trends everywhere. You see increases in ecosystem carbon, except for the maritime West Coast forests, which show a decline. And the black line on all these graphs are ecosystem carbon versus time. And you see a decline in the maritime West Coast forest, and the black line on each of those graphs is the average for the entire region. So it's the same value for each of those graphs. And so in summary, without a map, with just numbers, this is the list of the climate futures that we've been using, and you can see in red it's mid-century soil carbon stocks, in blue it's end of the century. We see an increase for every single instance. And then you look at change in vegetation carbon, and there the picture is not so clear. We have some that show no change, some that show a decline from mid-century to end of the century. You have some who show a brown down before a little green up. And then we have several models that show a plain increase in vegetation carbon. And so we can plot those models just like Dave did with change in carbon, change in precipitation versus change in temperature. We were trying to figure out what variable we could use, and I just picked carbon. We can use fire, we can use anything you want. But this shows the spread of those models. So in red, the results of the model for total ecosystem carbon for mid-century, average across that 2036, 2065, and in blue are the results for the end of the century. And you can see the dotted lines show you the trend from mid-century to end of the century. So you have positive trends that show no change, and some that are declining. So, and all the models spread out like this. So it's really interesting. What I'm really interested in is comparing the GCMs to the Earth system models to see, this is really the first time we really see what Earth system models are doing, how well they're doing. Those that include disturbance such as fire, some that don't, some that have many plant functional types, some that have a lot less. So there's a lot of things to think about in this. So in conclusion, we show vegetation shifts, mostly to subtropical types and also to woodier types. We have soil carbon gains across the entire area, mostly vegetation gains, except in the western Pacific Northwest and along the Rockies. We see increased frequency around the entire region, and the climate futures can be ranked with regard to carbon sequestration potential and trend. And so all the maps I've been showing you today are currently available publicly on databasin.org. There's a group called Integrated Scenarios of Climate, Hydrology, and Vegetation for the Western US. Everything you've seen is there. So sign up, you need to have an account, and you can have access to those. The Pacific Northwest, the North Pacific LCC has now contracted Conservation Biology Institute to put a special gateway into Databasin. And so this is the page that I showed here on the right-hand side in Databasin. If you go to the LCC, you will be able to access this directly. And soon we will put some of the summary climate data in there too. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have questions that cannot be answered right away, send me an email. I'll be glad to answer them.